as we approach Romans, what is Paul's reason for writing this whole letter?
Because he wants to go there.
Excellent. And when he goes there, what's he want to do?
Preach the gospel.
Preach the gospel. Thank you. You know that in your sleep. And before he
It's like
says,
8863.
what's that?
It's like 88.
8863. That's exactly right. Before he's going to tell us what he's got to say about the gospel, he works to establish that we need to hear it. Mm-hmm. If that's what he wants to do, Paul is a plotter. He dots I's and crosses T's. He wants to make sure his audience knows that they need to hear the gospel. And so how does he establish that we all need to hear the gospel? Because we are all sinners. We're all screwed up. And that applies to, and what screws us up the most? How does this screwed upness manifest itself? Idolatry. We worship idols. People that worship bushes and sticks worship idols. That's obvious. It breaks their relationship with God, breaks their relationship with nature, breaks their relationship with one another. But Christians do it too. How do we worship idols?
Money.
Well, money, but even more closer than money.
Clothes.
Clothes. Yeah, we're getting closer. Yes, that's very good. I'm not going to put up with this. I've been with the IRS all afternoon.
We're going to break you.
What do we do that shows that we're idol worshippers?
We're judgmental.
Yes, we're judgmental, which means we're doing something only God can do, which means what has become our God? We've become our God. You know, we take the role. We are putting ourselves in God's position. I do a little deal on Reformed theology, and this is a big deal in Reformed theology. It's like, and I think this is very Pauline, it's like we're under this dome, and human beings are looking for God, and there's this dome here, and on the inside of the dome is mirrors inside the dome, and so when we look to find God, we see reflections of ourselves, and we say, oh my goodness, isn't God good looking and smart and wise? Because he looks and he thinks like me. So he must be right. And we end up worshiping ourselves, which becomes a problem because once we worship ourselves and we are just so incredibly good, we stop entertaining the possibility of any other God. Because we've got the God we want, the one that thinks like us. And that's kind of what Paul is saying. That's what Christians do. We put ourselves in God's position as judge, therefore we are committing idolatry too. And then, since one of the issues in the Roman church is Jews coming in, and this will be a big deal later, in chapter 9, 10, and 11, the Jews are worshiping idols too because they worship. What do Jews worship?
The law.
They worship the law. They don't obey it, but they think they're special because they've
God's law first.
You're right. And so we're all idol worshipers. Therefore, all people are sinful or rotten. Depends on how you want to look at it. So none of us deserve a relationship with God. None of us. We are all lost. We are terrible. We are rolling around in the muck. Like Coco Chanel. If we can find muck, we're rolling it. Therefore, who's the only one that can solve this situation? Jesus and God, right? Yeah. Jesus is God. So yeah. God is the only one that can solve this problem. And because we can't, we're not able to. And what does God do? We talked about it last week. What does God do to solve this problem?
Put yourself on the cross.
Well, okay, hold on that because he's going to talk about that later. Yeah. But what in a basic, because he really hasn't started dealing with Jesus much. He's basically talking about God. What does God give that solves or starts to address this issue?
Free will.
Okay, true, but what does God give?
Grace.
Grace. God gives grace, right? And grace is a gift. God gives the gift of grace. We don't deserve it. Why don't we deserve it? Because we're sinful and roll around in muck. God gives us grace. Free, undeserved grace. We talked about it in Galatians. Same deal. And since God gives us grace, we respond, because it's He wants relationship, which is what righteousness means. He gives us grace so we can relate to Him. What's our leg in that relationship? What do we do? God gives us grace, and how do we respond to it?
Hope. Worship.
Both of which are good, but the word he focuses on is
Trust.
faith. And that's the reason that's important, and we'll talk about hope tonight. The reason trust is really important is all God looks for us to do is to trust that God has done what God has done. Which again makes sense, because if we don't trust that God's given us grace, then we can't relate to Him. The only way we can relate to Him is to trust that God has established this with us. So there's a logic behind it, and that's what Paul says. Now, he's got to go into that sort of the relationship, righteousness, relationship with God in a nutshell. Now, somebody in the back of the room is going to say, well, we get this by obeying the law. Who does Paul use as an example that says we don't receive the gift of grace and respond with faith? It cannot be based on the law. Who does he use as an example? Abraham. And God gave Abraham grace, and Abraham responded by faith, and he did it before the law existed. Since he did it before the law existed, it has to be based on grace and faith. It can't be based on obedience. Cannot be, because Abraham was righteous before there was anything to obey. So, at least that's what Paul says. That's how Paul is presenting it. Now, he's going to talk more in what we're looking at today. He's going to expand on what this faith and grace is all about, and that we're looking at the 5th chapter. So, right as soon as we get to the beginning of the 5th chapter, what does Paul assume right at the beginning of the 5th chapter?
Justified.
We're justified. Justified by?
Faith.
By faith. Man, he has spent the 4th chapter talking about it, right? So he assumes everybody here knows we are justified by faith. Now remember, the word here that's translated justify is the same word that's often translated righteous. Same Greek word, dekaus. And righteousness for Paul means to be in a right relationship. So, in other words, when he says, therefore we are justified by faith, we are in a relationship, a right relationship with God by His grace and our response by faith. Now the circle is complete. We have a relationship with God. Now, since we've got a relationship with God, what's the result? What's the first result that we receive, what's the first benefit from having this relationship with God?
Tribulations.
What's that?
Tribulations.
Well, hold on, tribulations. You're reading ahead. We're going to get to tribulations in a minute. But what's that?
Peace.
Thank you. We've got same verse, verse 1. We have peace with God, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what would peace with God be? What do you think that would look like? If we have peace with God, what does that mean?
Your confidence in the destiny.
We've got confidence. We have this. If you're in a peaceful relationship, like Debbie and I are in our relationship, that's right, peaceful relationship. That means we never have conflict. We never have disagreements. Everything is always wonderful. Calm. Right? Serene, that would be the word. We have peace with God. Well, maybe. I don't want to get into that. Okay, so that's what we have with God. And that, again, makes sense because, we God's given us grace. We're in a relationship with God, the right relationship with Him. Now, through whom is the peace given?
God.
Okay, it's given by God, but who's it through? How does God? And
Jesus.
Paul's going to explain this. It's going to be through Jesus. Now, he really hasn't talked much about Jesus yet, but he's going to start talking a lot about Jesus now. So this right relationship we have and the peace that comes from it is something done through Jesus Christ. And how does it affect the present? How does it affect us right now that we have peace with God? What does this mean? Now that we're in a relationship with God and there's peace, it's a good relationship, a righteous relationship. How does it affect us right this minute?
It's undeserved privilege.
Okay, we have an undeserved privilege. We've got this closeness with God. Now, how does that affect? So we've got peace with God now, right? So that's in the present because he's using present tense. So we're all at peace with God. How does it affect our future? If we have peace with God right now, how does that affect our future?
And hope.
Okay, we have hope. So we've got peace now, but we also have hope. And in what do we hope?
Glory to God.
Okay, well, we have hope in...
Sharing.
Yeah, the glory of God, right. We have hope that we're going to share in this glory of God, right? That's what we're looking forward to. Now, the fact that we have this peace and we have this hope enables us to do something that is kind of unexpected. What are we now able to do since we have this relationship with God that gives us peace and hope? What can we now do?
Have the ability to suffer.
Well, we have the ability to do what with suffering?
Endure it.
True, but what word does he use?
Tribulations.
What word does he use in verse 3?
Rejoice.
Okay, we can rejoice, we can boast, we can feel good in our suffering, right? All right. Now, why would we be able to do that? Why would we be able to feel? Why would we be able to boast in suffering? I mean, suffering isn't good, right? If we're in this relationship with God, why are we able to do that?
Work of patience.
Well, we're not even looking now. Look up from the scripture. Why would we be able to boast in suffering?
It says it helps to build your character.
Well, that's what he says. Let's not move there yet. Why would, knowing that we're in this right relationship with God, knowing that because of that we have peace and we have hope, why would that enable us to boast in suffering?
Because we know God's real.
Okay, good. That's it. We know God is real. We know God is in control, right? All right. Now, what else will we be able to do with respect to suffering? What else do we know about suffering? Because we can boast in it. How can we interpret it now?
It produces endurance and character.
Okay. Now we can start seeing suffering when it says produces character and character hope and hope doesn't disappoint. How is our whole perspective on suffering changed? Because of this relationship we have and the peace and hope that comes from it. How does our whole view of suffering change? How can it change?
Temporary.
Well, that's right. It becomes something that's temporary, and it becomes something that can actually help us, build us up, help us grow. So instead of viewing suffering when we have no peace with God and no hope, then suffering is something that is horrible, destructive. It has no positive purpose at all. But since we have peace with God, and since we have the hope of sharing in His glory, we can now look at problems not as something that controls us, but something that can actually help us become better than we actually are, can help us grow. We're really talking about verses 3 and 4, right? with
Okay.
3 and 4, that it produces endurance. So suffering can have good results, but that's for Paul only going to happen when we recognize the relationship with God is right. Okay?
Did you watch Slumdog Millionaire, the movie?
I've never seen it. Would love to, but I've never seen it.
Have you seen it?
What
Great movie. Well, he goes through, I don't want to ruin it because I didn't watch it, but he goes through all of these awful things in his life until he gets to this one point, and all of those awful things enable him to succeed.
Okay.
Like, I'll just ruin one. He works in a call center,
Uh-huh.
and because they want to pretend that they're not overseas, all the aisles are named for English streets.
Okay.
So he knows English streets. He can answer this question,
Right.
not because he knows, but because he was working this terrible job and they named the hallways for the streets. So, like, to a lesser,
Well, but that's it. At one time when I was younger, much younger, I was really very focused on exercise. I was an exercise guy. And in fact, Debbie remembers. I was really an exercise guy. And one of the things that principles we followed, and you never really understood it, but I did, we used to say, no pain, no gain. No pain, no gain. And that's what you did. You worked until you felt pain, because that was supposed to be constructive. That wouldn't be constructive unless I believed that I was moving in a positive direction. And that's what knowing God does. That's what trusting God does. Enables us to feel peace and hope, which changes our perspective on suffering. Okay? So, now, according to verse 6, how can we? Because remember, this begins with 4, so he's explaining what he has just established. According to verse 6, how or why can we now boast? What has happened that would cause this boasting to occur?
Christ came at the right time and died for sinners.
Okay, Christ came at the right time to die for sinners. Now it's really interesting because Paul says we have peace, which is in the present tense, right? And hope, which is focused on the future. Now in verse 6, as he explains that, he uses what tense? In verse 6.
Past.
He uses past tense. So I don't think that's it. Paul is calling this all together. So if Christ died in the past, what does that mean in terms of control now for us? In other words, did we control Christ dying in the past? Well, that would be the dumbest thing. If somebody said, yeah, well, I got control over the past, then you got some kind of time machine. Christ already died. You got no control over that. He's already done it. So, because Christ died in the past, we have this peace and hope that enables us to boast. Now, he also says that Christ did it while we were...
My translation says ungodly people.
Okay, ungodly. Well, look before the ungodly,
Helpless.
right? When we were helpless or
Mine
weak.
says weak.
Yeah, when we were helpless or weak. Now, what does that mean? Why would he say Christ died for us, for the ungodly, which is us, and Paul's already established it because we all worship idols. Why does he also call us weak? It's bad enough he calls humanity ungodly. Why does he call them weak?
Scarcely a righteous man.
Okay, well, why would we be weak?
Not able to withstand the suffering.
Yeah, we can't, and we can't do what God has done. Because he's already said it's not about obedience, it's about faith. So we were incapable of saving ourselves. We were weak. But we were also ungodly because we worship idols. Now, how does Paul, and this is what you said, Donna, how does Paul establish that this is a remarkable thing for anybody to do, to die for the ungodly? Why is that an amazing thing for anyone, including God, to do.
Because most people wouldn't even die for somebody who was a righteous person.
Most people are not going to die even if they're in a relationship with them, right? Even if they have a relationship with them, doesn't mean they're going to die for them. Although, maybe if the person is really good, they might. But what's remarkable about God is what?
He shows his love for each of us.
Yeah, when we were sinners. You know, he says, maybe if you're already in a relationship, maybe you would, probably not. You know, you don't die even if you're in a relationship. Maybe if the person with whom you're related is really, really good, you might. But what makes God remarkable is Jesus died when we were at our what? Worst. We were at our worst when Jesus died. Now remember, he's talking about past tense, right? So he's not talking about now. It's not something we control. This is something that God has already done. Now, if this is something that's already done, and he's going to establish it in a little bit, this death of Christ is going to be connected to grace, this gift that God has given. Okay? Now, with that being the case, what might we logically assume? If God has done this incredible thing to die for us when we're at our worst, what might we logically assume that's also talking about this peace and hope?
Save us from God's condemnation.
Okay, good. First, it's going to be that we have been justified by his blood. We're also going to be saved from condemnation. And that's pointing towards what? The future. And now we've got the hope. So as a result of this relationship we have with God, we have peace and we have hope. And somehow it's grounded, and Paul hasn't explained it yet. Somehow it's grounded in what Christ did when we were at our worst. Because of what he did, we can feel peace now because we're justified, and we can feel hope. We're going to avoid God's wrath. In verse 10, how does he kind of rephrase?
Reconciled.
What's that?
Reconciled.
Okay, he uses a new word, right? That we are reconciled. Hasn't used that word before. What does it mean? When we were enemies, while we were enemies, what happened to us?
We were reconciled.
We were reconciled to God, and we will be
Saved
by his life. So we were reconciled as a result of the death, and we're going to be, and having been reconciled, we're going to be saved by his life. Okay? Now, what would reconcile mean?
Like reconnected?
Okay, we're reconnected. Which is kind of what righteousness is all about. We've been connected to God. So as a result of righteousness, this relationship we now have with God, which he talks about in verse 1, what are the two things that we have right here and now? Well, hold up. We've already talked about it. This is sort of a review. What do we have?
Grace and trust.
Well, we have grace and trust. That's the basis of the relationship. What have we received as a result of this righteous relationship we're in?
Peace and hope.
That's it. We've got peace now, and we've got hope as we look forward. Why? Because we're in this righteous relationship with God. Now, that's what he spent 10 verses explaining. Okay.
A few times they say will be saved.
Very good.
So that doesn't mean that happens right now. Something's going to happen in the future.
That's right. Reflects how Paul views salvation. Paul doesn't view salvation as something that has happened now. He doesn't believe we are saved. If Paul were here, he would look at us and say, there's not a person in this room that's saved. Not a person in this room is saved. And we would say, well, Paul, you just don't understand. I was saved when I was 19 years old at church camp. And Paul would say, saved from what? What were you saved from? Saved from sin? Yeah. Well, do you sin? Still sin? Well, yeah. Okay, so you weren't saved from sin. Saved from death? Does it mean you won't die? Yeah. I've got eternal life. So you won't die. You'll continue to exist forever. Well, kind of, but I will. So you're not saved from death either. So explain to me exactly what you're saved from. Well, I guess nothing. Yes, that's right. Because salvation is something that occurs when? In the future. Salvation is something that occurs and then God will save you. And for Paul, take a guess when that'll happen in the future.
It's already happened.
At the resurrection.
Resurrection of the dead. When you're raised from the dead, the general resurrection of the dead, that's when you experience salvation. Because you're in a new heaven and a new earth. Death has been defeated. Sin has been defeated. Now you are truly saved. Because you're not affected by either sin or death. You haven't, that's why he'll say in the 8th chapter, he'll say, we have, and it's the only time he uses, and he uses it in the perfect tense. He says, we have been saved, and then he says, but only in hope. We have been saved, but only in hope. Which means the only salvation we experience now is what? Hoping the salvation, in hope of the salvation that's coming. And that's what Paul says. That's what Paul writes. Now, understand, other writers use the word, and the word is sudzo, uses the word in a different way. And John writes about salvation happening now, that you're saved now. Well, great. That's what John wrote. Because John's perspective on salvation is different than Paul's. Doesn't mean one's right and one's wrong. It's just they have a different perspective. And that's one of the reasons why you got to study Scripture. You can't assume that everything in Scripture is exactly the same, like written by the same hand. Different brains processed it. Okay, so we know as a result of righteousness, we now have peace with God in the present. We have hope in the future because in the future we're going to be saved, and that gives us hope. As a result, because remember, he started this by talking about boasting, right? As a result of this, how can our boasting be even bigger? Because he says we can boast in suffering. How can our boasting be even broader?
Builds character and strength.
That's exactly right. In verse 11, given what he just wrote, we can actually do what? What does it say in verse 11?
Take pride in God.
Yeah, we can take pride. We can boast in God through Jesus Christ, right? Because through Jesus Christ we have what? Reconciliation. Okay, man,
He's friends of God.
Yeah, he started this by talking about boasting, right? And he finishes the section talking about boasting. Now, if I'm looking at this, if I'm reading this as I would read anything else, if he talked about boasting at the beginning and then talked about boasting later, then maybe that's sort of a self-contained unit, which means in verse 12 we're moving on to something else. He's made his point, we're moving on to something else. And I think that's what happens in verse 12. I think you can also see by the first word in verse 12. What's the first word in your translations?
Wherefore.
When, therefore, we're talking about something, he's using a preposition to move us forward. We're moving forward. Remember, I've said, Paul is a plotter. He explains and explains and explains. He's explained why we can boast. The relationship we have with God enables us to feel peace and hope. Now, in verse 12, what does Paul establish? Because now he's moving forward. What does he establish in verse 12?
All sin.
Okay, we've got sin. Now he hasn't talked a lot about sin. You know, at least in terms of what it does and what it does to us. He's described what it is, but he hasn't really talked much about what it does and how it spread.
Why does that say for that all have sinned?
Right. Therefore sin is what? It's universal, right? Everybody is sin.
Yes.
Yes, that's right. We are all sin. That's why we all wallow around in the muck. Okay? Now, in verse 12 though, he and this is something he's going to develop for the rest of the chapter. What does he say about sin?
It came in the world through one man.
Okay, it came in to the world through one person, one man, right? Now, do we know what man it is yet? No, we don't, because he doesn't say it. But one man was the one through whom sin came into the world, and what is the result of sin? Okay, death. Now, has he talked about the relationship between sin and death yet? No, he hasn't. But Paul is a plotter. You better believe he's going to talk about it. But we don't have a connection yet. He's just introducing the idea. And what happened as a result of sin and death coming in as a result of one man?
It spread to everyone.
Okay, sin spreads to everyone. Death spreads to everyone. Because
Everyone.
everybody sinned. So we know, according to Paul, there's some connection between sin and death. We don't know what it is yet, but we know there's a connection. Sin came from one man, and because of that, death came, and everybody dies, therefore everybody has to have sinned. Now, what's the relation? Because remember, we've still got these Jews entering the church. What's the relationship who believe the law is really important? What's the relationship between sin and law? And he's already talked about that. He talked about it in the 3rd chapter.
Sin came first.
Okay, sin came first. Now, that's interesting, that sin came before the law. Because remember in chapter 3, he said, what is the law? What does the law do? What does it actually do? It doesn't make us good people.
Gives us guidance.
Well, it does give us guidance,
Shows
but
us right and wrong.
okay, in particular, it shows us when we're doing wrong. The law tells us when we're wrong. You know, the law shows us when we sin, right? Now, he says that the law, that sin came before there was a law, right? So the law isn't the cause of sin, right? What else has he already said came before the law? What has he already established and been talking about came before the law?
Abraham's
Good.
promise.
Abraham, and with Abraham, what came with Abraham? What happened with Abraham? How does he use Abraham as an example?
He's like going to be the descendant, like all the descendants in the lands.
He's going to be the descendants of many. And what happened between God and Abraham? What happened between, using language Paul has already established?
God made a promise to him and he was obedient.
Okay, that's right, you're right, but we're not using language Paul used. And he really didn't talk, when he talked about Abraham, those weren't the words he used.
He had a righteous
Good. God entered a righteous relationship with Abraham. God's grace, right? And Abraham did what? Trusted. So we have this righteous relationship with Abraham. Now, in this righteous relationship, all of that occurred before the law too. Therefore, our relationship with God isn't based on obedience, isn't based on our obeying the law. It's based on grace, faith, right? So, both righteousness and sin were present before there was any law. Now, before the law, since the law didn't exist, sin wasn't sort of counted against you because you can't disobey something that you don't have. Which means sin for Paul is a little different than disobedience. Because if it were purely disobedient, if it's purely doing naughty things, then you couldn't have sin without law, right? You'd need to know when you were doing naughty stuff. But Paul says sin existed before law existed, which means sin may be shown by disobedience, but it isn't disobedience, it's something else.
It's a little, how do you know if it's a sin? I mean, it's kind of circular thinking, but how do you know it's a sin if there's no law to tell you that it's a sin?
But that's what Paul says, that's exactly right. And therefore, for Paul, the meaning of sin, hamartia, must be a little different than doing sinful things. That doing sinful things isn't sin itself. Sin is a little deeper than that because it existed before the law existed. And he's already established right here, he's going to talk a little bit more about it. He says sin is connected to what? Right here. Sin is connected to what? When sin came, what else came? Death. And Paul will say, and he'll say it in just a little bit, obviously, sin existed before the law because before the law, what happened to people? They died. And if sin brings death and people died before the law, that means sin had to exist before the law. So the law shows us that we're sinful, but it's not sin. Violating it isn't sin in and of itself. Okay. This is Paul's logic. Therefore, sin came before the law just like righteousness came before the law. Now, he said sin came as a result of one person, right?
Adam.
Okay, good. It came as a result of Adam. And he even says, sin, it exercised dominion between the time of Adam and Moses, because between Adam and Moses, what happened to people? They died. So physical death didn't occur when Moses brought the law down from the mountain. People were dying before then, which means sin must have been a reality before Moses. He says it's brought in by Adam. Now, what makes Adam important? Who is Adam?
First man.
Okay, he's the first man. Now, one of the things that's really interesting with Adam, and I think Paul recognizes it, and this is how he uses it.
Are you back in 14?
I am in 14.
All right.
Yes. Adam. That's it. Adam in Hebrew refers to humanity. It's not a proper name. Well, it could be a proper name, but it means human being, because Adam is the one from the Adamah. And Adamah in Hebrew is dirt. And remember in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, what does God do? Yeah, he creates a little mud man, right? And does what to the little mud man? Breathes breath. And the little mud man becomes a living being. So Adam means the one from the dirt. Which means if I'm Hebrew and I read the story of Adam in Genesis 2 and 3, every time I hit Adam, I'm not thinking of Adam as an individual. I'm thinking of Adam as what? Human being. So Adam's story becomes our story. Becomes our story. But we miss it in the English because we put Adam as a proper name and assume it's a historical story about one person. And it isn't. It was never meant to be that. It's a story of humanity. That's what it is. Okay, but Paul's going to use Adam. Okay, and he's going to contrast. So sin came as a result of Adam. and everybody sinned. Now, that makes more sense if we see Adam as representative of humanity, because he's going to compare Adam. Adam, sin, death, right? Who does he compare him to? So we've got Adam on one side. Who's on the other side?
Moses.
Christ.
Well, Christ is. Christ is on the other side, verse 15, right? Because of Adam, what happens to humanity?
They died.
They die. Because of the other man, one man, what happens?
Live.
They live. Because of the one man who is Jesus, they live. Free gift of grace, right? So now we've got, because that's still sort of a loose end. It's through the one man, Jesus, that grace is ultimately given. Now we don't know how yet, but he'll explain it. But it's through the one man, Jesus, that grace has abounded. And which of the two is greater? Is the sin greater than the grace?
No.
Heck no. Whatever we create can't be greater than what God has created. And this grace, again, Paul reminds us, is what? A free gift. It is not, in other words, it is not what?
Purchased.
It's not purchased. It's not
Like
earned. It is a
Conditional,
gift.
yeah.
That's right. It's a gift, and all we need to do is trust that it was given. And how does the effect of sin and grace differ? As we look at verse 16. How does it differ? What does sin result in?
death.
Results in death. It results in condemnation. What does grace result in?
Acquittal.
Acquittal, right. And relationship. So as a result of grace, we are now in that relationship, which he's already talked about, completed by faith. But now, according to Paul, we know how it's happened. It happened through Jesus Christ. Through Jesus Christ, that relationship, that grace-faith relationship was established. Now, again, Paul is a plotter, so he's going to repeat himself in verse 17. Because what does he say in verse 17?
Because of the sin of the one man, Adam,
Okay,
caused death to rule over many.
right. He's already said that, right? That it's through Adam came death. And why did death come through Adam? Because what else came through Adam? Sin came, and as a result of sin, death came. Now again, we don't know the relationship yet. We just know that there's a relationship between sin and death. Paul's going to talk about that in the next chapter. What that relationship between sin and death is all about. And what's the effect of the one man? So one man, Adam, sin, death. One man, Christ.
But even greater is God's wonderful grace, that his gift of righteousness for all who receive will live in triumph.
Okay, through one man. Now, Paul is doing something kind of interesting here. And he does the same thing in 1 Corinthians 15. He's kind of saying we are all in Adam, in that we all sin and we all die. The first man. But we're also all in Christ, in that we all have relationship. God, we all have this free gift of grace, and we all have the possibility of being in a relationship, this righteous relationship with God. So what he does is he uses these two figures sort of to describe humanity. We are all in Adam, we are all in Christ. He does the exact same thing in 1 Corinthians 15.
And what becomes of the people before Jesus?
Well, what Paul seems to indicate is that Christ becomes representative of all humanity from the very beginning. So all humanity after Adam is in Adam. We are all Adam, in that we all sin and die. We are also all in Christ. Now, we may not know it, and we certainly may not trust it, but we're all in Christ in that God is showing grace to humanity. This is something God is showing to everybody. So these become sort of images that encompass all people. So in a sense, we are bipolar in that we have Adam and we have Christ, and we're in both. Does that make sense? That we are in both. Okay? Because he's going to explain why this is really important, but not yet. And what's the result of the fact that we're sort of in both?
We became sinners.
Yeah, we become sinners and condemnation, and we also become righteous, therefore we have relationship with God. And that's why he'll talk about all. He uses the word all. He doesn't say that we're in Christ because we want to be in Christ. What Paul says is we are in Christ. Why? Because we're part of humanity and God did it. Why would Paul not say Christ did it, but only because we wanted it, only when we wanted him to do it? What would be some of the problems if that's what Paul said? That you decide where you're going to be.
I feel like you're making yourself God.
We're back to idolatry, right? Because we're setting up rules on how to do it. So we become God.
We can never do enough.
We can never do enough. That's right. So, or we can make it really, really low so that it's easy for us to do it. Maybe easy for me, but maybe harder for you by the rules that I've set up. I'm also violating just fundamental logic. If Jesus Christ died for us, then if that only applies to me if I want it to, then somehow I'm controlling what God did in the past. And how can I do that? I can't nail Jesus to a cross. I can't do that. That's already been done. Okay, and that becomes really, really important for Paul. So what has happened, God has caused to happen. And it's through one person's disobedience that sin and death came. Through one person's obedience to God, life, righteousness and life came. Now, we still have the law hanging around. And there's only one verse left. Because Paul wants to make sure we tie it up. What then is the role of the law?
Condemnation versus justification.
Okay, well, because of the law, what happened? And we've already kind of talked about it.
Sin increased.
Sin increased. Why would sin increase when the law is given?
Because they realize they're sinning.
Right.
Someone's watching.
Well, that's right. If there's no speed limit, then you can't speed. You can't speed. But as soon as you put a speed limit, I'm going to go 5 miles over because they won't give me a ticket. Now that I have a law, I have the possibility of doing what? Breaking it, which shows that
You're disobedient.
that I'm disobedient. So the law just increases the sin, right? Now, understand, there's some problems with that. Because somebody in the back of the room is going to raise their hand and say, well, then Paul, is the law bad? Is the law evil? If the law increases sin, doesn't that make the law bad? But the law came from, who was the source of the law? God did. God gave the law to Moses. then God gave something bad to humanity? Ooh, we got a problem. Paul is going to address it, of course, because he addresses all the problems that he's got. He also says you've got the law increased sin, but as sin increased, what happened to grace? It multiplied, right? Okay, now we're gonna have a problem there. Because when sin increases, grace increases to cover sin. Then maybe it's better to sin. Because the more I sin, the more grace I receive. If I sin only this much, how much grace do I get?
Not that much.
This much. But if I sin this much, how much grace do I get? Ha ha ha. I got a whole bunch. So doesn't it make sense to sin a lot? So that you get even more grace?
I don't know about that.
Okay, good. But Paul's going to deal with that. Because that's a question he's going to anticipate somebody asking. And, we've talked about it before. Christians, we've kind of gotten, there's some groups of Christians that kind of get that in their head. That's better to sin a lot so that grace is big. We talked about testimonies. I've never heard a testimony where somebody stood up and said, well, I was pretty good. I never did much bad. I always went to church. Family was good. Never got in much trouble. And I'm a Christian. Is that a testimony? Does anybody listen to a testimony like that? Heck no. What's in a testimony?
Oh, bad stuff.
Oh, I was a drug addict. And I drank too much and I stepped on puppies and I was horrible. Terrible. Yes, I was an awful person. But what happened?
God forgave me.
Ooh, I got saved and God forgave me and grace just poured upon me and I am a different person. That's what
struck you on the
yes. That's right. But that's what makes a good testimony, right?
Yeah.
You never hear a testimony where a person hasn't done anything.
And then you get all those people together in Corinth in the church and you start up.
That's exactly right. Well, but that's the attitude that you can get from if sins increase, grace increases. So that's what a good testimony. I'm going to increase my sins so
We get more grace.
So the grace is even greater and more dramatic and spectacular. And that's what Paul is going to deal with. Is that true? Because if it's true, then we should do what?
Sin all over.
We should sin a lot. In fact, the more we sin, the more grace we're going to receive. Now, Bill, you're comfortable with that, aren't you?
No.
No. Well, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give you a hint.
What?
This is a spoiler alert. Neither is Paul.
Okay.
Paul isn't happy with that attitude either. Okay, so we've got sin and death having control of humanity, and life and righteousness, right relationship coming through
The Lord.
coming through Jesus, right? And now we've still got sin floating around there, and that's a problem, because as long as there's sin, how can I truly trust in God? Isn't sin going to get in the way of me trusting that grace has been given, right? If sin is a reality, and clearly it is, because it results in death and people die. If sin is a reality, isn't that going to affect my ability to trust in God? And if it does, then something has to be done with the sin. God's going to need to do something with the sin, something that we can't do. Why can't we do anything about sin?
God.
Yeah, it's got to be God. I mean, one, we like it. I mean, sin is not bad. We love worshiping idols, especially when they look like us. And we can control them. We like that. Those are the gods we like, the gods we control.
For the same reason we can't choose salvation.
That's exactly right. Or not the salvation here, that he talks about.
Right.
We can create our own, But then if we create our own salvation, what are we doing?
We're becoming God.
We're becoming God, which is
Sin.
idolatry, which is sin. So if we, and that's this irony, if we create a God we control, that we can manipulate, then we become God. We become God. And that's what Paul says is at the core of sin. And when you think about it, it really is. It's not murder and rape and stealing stuff. It's believing that I can do it. That it's okay for me to do it. That becomes the core of sin. And that's what Paul... So we've got to somehow deal with sin, because if we don't, then we're going to approach God in this sinful way. We're going to assume that I can control grace by what I do, which means I become God. God is beholding to me. So something's going to have to happen. And that's what we're going to look at next week in chapter 6, verses 1 through 14. We'll talk about how this happens. And I'll tell you, if you've never seen, what is it? What's that show that was on AMC? Was it The Walking Dead?
Yeah.
Yeah, is that the name of the show? Walking Dead? I've never seen it. But Walking Dead, about zombies,
Yeah.
That are dead and walking around. Well, for Paul, we are the walking dead.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what he's going to say in chapter 6, 1 through 14, that we are the walking dead. Any questions? Paul is methodical. This is cool stuff.
There's a lot there. There's just take it in so many different directions.
You sure can. And sometimes, and we were talking on Wednesday morning, because we're doing King. And we were talking about how when you get into the flow, you get into the narrative, and all of a sudden things make sense because they connect. And even though the stories are kind of isolated, the writer is bringing them together and shaping them into one narrative. And so, but you got to look at it as a narrative. If you look at it as isolated stories, they don't seem to relate at all. But if you start looking at it as a narrative and start thinking, well, why did the writer include this? Why did he put this story in here? What is his purpose in doing that? What does he want his audience, his reader, to believe as a result of it? All of a sudden it makes sense. Same thing with Paul. You got to get into the flow. If you're just looking at isolated things, it gets really confusing. But if you start looking at the flow, man, it all starts to relate and connect with one another, I think. And that's what makes Paul really remarkable. So, all right, let's have a word of prayer, and then I'm going to call the IRS again. Okay. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together. Remind us, and the message is really, really simple, that we have been made righteous through your grace and our faith. And as a result of that righteousness, we have peace right now and hope as we move into the future. Remind us of that as we go about our living. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. So thank you.